Professor Dede here today, talking more international relations, and today I'm going to focus on the time period of the Cold War, focusing a lot on world politics and economics during that time and some of the crises that were involved. The Cold War was a bipolar global battle between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a state of tension and distrust between the two superpowers. The early days of the Cold War began where both sides started slowly mistrusting each other. By 1946, the Western powers began to perceive a growing Soviet threat. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill warned of an Iron Curtain was descending across Europe, dividing the West from the Soviet-controlled East. President Truman concluded the best way to counter the Soviet actions was to stand firm. Standing up to the Soviets would be the solution to the Cold War. In 1947, Britain, weakened and devastated by the war, asked the United States to help finance the rebuilding of Europe. This became known as the Marshall Plan. It created an economic aid package to help rebuild war-torn Europe. The idea behind it was give a lot of money to these European countries that need it to prevent them from going socialist or communist. Let them rebuild their economies with some capitalism. The Soviet Union's satellite countries rejected Marshall Plan aid and forbade their satellites from even accepting any of the money. What the Marshall Plan did was revitalize Western Europe economies and stop the communist aggression and movements in its path. The Truman Doctrine was a policy of aiding countries attempting to resist and contain communism, doing anything it could to stop the movement. Truman portrayed the Cold War as a conflict between good and evil, a conflict between democracy and communism. The U.S. domino theory held that basically if one country fell to communism, like dominoes, everyone else would follow. The first crisis of this Cold War was in 1948 over the Berlin blockade. The Soviet Union closed all the roads leading into Berlin. In 1945, we were bombing Berlin. By 1948, we were flying in 24/7 food, coal, and other supplies to help save the Berlin area and to help rebuild their economies. After about a year, the Soviets finally gave in and ended the blockade. The Berlin Airlift showed U.S. support against communism without firing a shot. Also in 1949, NATO was formed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Western European countries joining Canada and the United States to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In a nutshell, what NATO was this: an attack on one NATO country was an attack on all. So if the Soviet Union attacked Belgium, it was like if the United States was attacked. It was kind of like an all for one. We're going to go in this together and basically stand strong against communism. One of the most interesting people during this movement was a man named George Kenyon. He was the American diplomat and the father of the policy of containment, inspiring the Truman Doctrine. Kenyon favored a sphere of influence approach in Europe to reduce the Soviet power and influence in that region. In 1946, he sent a 5,000-word telegram to the Secretary of State outlining a strategy of how to handle diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. He said at the bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is a traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Stalin needed hostility to legitimize his rule. His idea, Kenyon's, was to strengthen Western institutions and render them invulnerable to the Soviet challenge, and to wait slowly but surely for the mellowing of the Soviet regime. During this time period, after World War II, world economic affairs started to change. International political economies changed. The U.S. emerged as a hegemon, dominating global world production. The Cold War was really all over the globe, especially in Asia. Communists and nationalists had been struggling for control of China for many years. In World War II, the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, were weakened due to corruption and undemocratic policies. In 1949, China fell to the communists of Mao Zedong. Now, why didn't the U.S. go into China when we were practicing containment and stopping communism? It would have taken millions of men. It would have been a guerrilla warfare. Also, Russia had developed an atomic bomb at that time. So this would have been definitely a no-win situation. From 1949 to 1971, Mao was unwilling to pursue diplomatic relations with the West. His focus was on growing China economically and enhancing his own revolution, two things he wasn't succeeding at. The results in China and Russia's test of the atomic bomb showed the U.S. military and political and economic measures, in general, would be necessary to carry out containment. Within a year, you had the Korean War. Korea was divided after World War II between Soviet and U.S. occupation zones. In 1950, North Korean forces attacked the South, unifying the country. The United Nations, led by the United States, went in to Korea to basically take back the South Korean territory. In 1950, though, in November, China invaded to help the North. The war became a 3-year stalemate until July of 1953, when North and South Korea basically announced an armistice, a ceasefire, ending the hostilities. This war heightened the tension between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, leading the U.S. to believe all communist threats were detrimental to U.S. interests. One of the key players during the Cold War was also the Third World nations, the non-aligned movements, the countries that basically said, when it comes to this Cold War conflict, we want to be neutral. Countries like India and Egypt basically said, we want no involvement between you guys, but economically, we'll take any aid you want to give us. So each of the two superpowers, in many ways, were trying to do things to snuggle up to these third world countries, to get them and convince them to say, hey, support us. By 1960, the Cold War started to change, especially with the election of President Kennedy. His administration promised to strengthen the United States with a stronger defense and active foreign policy. The first movement in this was the attempted Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba in 1960 that was an utter failure. It humiliated the United States and alarmed Castro. Later that year, the Berlin Wall was constructed by East Germans to basically wall off the western part of Berlin and to stop people from going into Berlin. This measure was an economic measure due to the stem of professional and intellectual and skilled workers who were fleeing to the West. And the idea behind the wall was to stop the brain drain from East Germany into West Germany. In 1962, the biggest crisis of the Cold War occurred with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union had placed medium-range missiles in Cuba. They had not been detected by the United States until it was almost too late. Kennedy demanded that the missiles be removed, or else. For 13 days, each side negotiated, and in the end, the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a pledge from the United States not to invade Cuba and for a secret pledge to remove obsolete missiles from Turkey. The result of this and this tension, both sides realized they came too close to nuclear war. In 1963, they instituted a hotline system, a telephone system between both leaders, that if there was a crisis, they could talk on the phone. Also, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was enunciated in 1963. In 1963, it is known as the year that President Kennedy died. But it's also a year that the U.S. at that time had 16,000 troops in Vietnam. President Diem was overthrown and killed in a CIA coup. But the North Vietnamese Communist forces still were gaining the upper hand. Kennedy wanted to find a way out of Vietnam, but it was coming up to an election year, and he realized he couldn't give up on Vietnam till after the '64 election. President Johnson comes into power after Kennedy's death, and by 1965, Johnson was increasing combat forces in Vietnam to stop a communist victory. Johnson saw this as a political battle. He didn't want to be a president who lost a war. So he sent in many troops he thought the Vietnamese in time would give up, but they weren't willing to give up. By 1968, 500,000 U.S. soldiers were in Vietnam. By 1975, the war ended, unsuccessfully for the United States. We could not give the South Vietnamese people the freedom they wanted because they did not want that freedom as much as we wanted it for them. When Richard Nixon became president, he wanted to institute a policy of détente between the United States and Soviet Union. Basically, détente is a French word for peaceful coexistence. In other words, Let's work together with these countries. Let's find things we can agree on and make things less tenseful. Nixon recognized the Chinese-Soviet disputes and wanting leverage over Russia. In 1972, Nixon visited China. Nixon was known as a strong anti-communist, and by going to China, he saw it as a flexibility that they were willing to improve relations. Nixon wanted to develop economic relations with China, use China to help get out of Vietnam, which didn't succeed, but also scare the Soviets into doing some actions to lessen tensions. By May of 1972, the United States and Soviet Union signed a Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty designed to stabilize the economy. One thing about arms control agreements, they're designed to get rid of obsolete equipment. They're not designed to get rid of the things you're developing. It's designed to basically say, we promise to make no more of missile X that's obsolete because now we got missile Y. Another tense point during this time period was in 1973 with the Arab-Israeli War, resulting in a U.S. alert, actually, of nuclear forces when this war started. And during the Yom Kippur War, both sides engaged in massive supplies for each of their allies, Egypt and Israel, to try to support each one. By the time of President Carter in 1977, Carter wanted to emphasize human rights in foreign policy. He worked with Brezhnev for a Second SALT agreement, but when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, installing a pro-Soviet regime, Carter basically reacted very negatively. He basically said, we're not going to go to the Olympics in 1980. We're going to support the freedom fighters. Carter placed economic sanctions on the Soviets. Reagan, when he became president, used harsh rhetoric against the Soviets and escalated the arms race. Reagan's idea was, I'm going to spend so much money, I'm going to bankrupt the Soviet Union out of existence. We're going to develop so many weapons and so many things, the Soviets are going to basically say, we can't keep up, and they're going to cry uncle. The Reagan Doctrine called for large increases in U.S. military spending, Strategic Defense Initiative known as Star Wars, and pledged support for anti-communist guerrillas. The Soviet Union was called an evil empire by Reagan. By 1985, things started to change when Mikhail Gorbachev became head of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was trying to implement reforms. He inherited a system that was dying. So he was more than willing to do things on strategic arms and also lessen the tensions because he was trying to save the Soviet Union from all the problems they were having. The U.S. stopped propping up some of their Soviet satellite nations and stopped financing them. In turn, many of the countries of Eastern Europe, like Poland and Czechoslovakia, said to hell with communism, and by the late 80s, they became democratic republics. In 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down, and by 1991, the Soviet Union technically goes out of existence. When you think about why the Cold War ended, the Reagan-Gorbachev factor is huge. Sometimes it takes the right leaders at the right time, if you think about the individual level of analysis. Also, the failure of communism. Many people thought communism would end because of political reasons, but it was an economic failure. America became the winners of the Cold War. But when you become the winner of the Cold War, you also become, congratulations, the country that everyone turns to when there are problems all across the globe. The last thing I'll mention briefly, in talking about arms control and disarmament, throughout history there's been a big push to reducing arms. Ironically, the United States is the top nation in the world for selling weapons across the globe. Arms control is a very difficult issue because it engages, for the United States, our opportunity to sell these weapons. Also, we make a lot of money selling these weapons, and also it provides jobs to people. The problem is people historically have always wanted to have more weapons for fear of invasion, also leverage. North Korea is a poor, broke-ass nation. Iran, very much the same situation, but they want to develop these weapons to get Western powers to pay attention to them and maybe give them some of the things they want. And that becomes part of the thing. In 1968, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, sought to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and prohibit states that didn't have nukes from acquiring them. Good on paper, but very unenforceable. These issues during the Cold War dominated the debate. During the Cold War era that I lived in, people were concerned about nuclear warfare, whereas today, people's concern is international terrorism.